The industrial ledger just flashed a warning signal that hasn't triggered in 40 years. The mechanism that prices the world's most essential metal is beginning to fracture. If you think this is just another commodity cycle, you are missing the historical signal. Because right now, a deficit is mathematically locking in that the market refuses to acknowledge. The people who understand the timeline aren't warning you. They are quietly securing physical inventory. You've seen this pattern with silver. The paper derivative market is suppressed while the physical vaults are drained. It's the same levers, the same players, the same inevitable outcome. Copper is now following that exact historical blueprint. But this time, the scale is geopolitical. The demand is structural. And the divergence between the paper promises and the physical reality is about to undergo a violent reconciliation. This isn't speculation. This is mathematical certainty. And once you see the supply cliffs, you cannot unsee them. Why copper is the next regime change. Let's look at the archaeology of this shift. For decades, copper was boring. It was wiring and pipes, predictable flow, steady consumption. But that era is effectively over. Copper has transitioned from a construction material to a strategic choke point for civilization. Look at the mechanics of the energy transition. A combustion engine uses 50 pounds of copper. An electric vehicle? 180. That is a 3x multiplier on raw materials. We aren't talking about a margin of error here. Global adoption is compounding. The math demands nearly 2 million additional tons of metal annually just for transport. Then look at the grid. Wind and solar are copper-intensive assets, 5 times the metal density of natural gas. Every government is mandating this shift simultaneously. The IEA's own data, which is usually conservative, admits we need millions of tons of new metal by 2030 just to keep the lights on. Now, layer in the AI infrastructure build-out. Data centers are the new oil refineries. They consume massive power, and power requires transmission. You are looking at a structural step change in consumption. This is not a cycle. It is a regime change. The problem is the geology. New mines take 15 years to bring online. We stopped exploring a decade ago. Production is flatlining. Ore grades are collapsing. We are moving twice the rock for half the metal compared to 30 years ago. The physics of extraction have hit a wall. The invisible rule, the supply chain crisis. Here is the mechanism the news isn't reporting. The East is quietly seizing control of the physical float. Look at the import ledgers. China's intake is rising faster than their economy. Why? Because they are engaging in strategic stockpiling. They are moving metal out of the visible exchange warehouses and into state reserves. They are securing the asset before the revaluation occurs. Meanwhile, the visible inventories on the LME are bleeding out. The buffer is gone. Yet, the paper market remains complacent. Futures contracts are being traded as if supply is infinite. This is the liquidity trap. There are now vastly more paper claims on copper than there is physical metal to settle them. Do you see the precedent? This is the silver paradox. The paper price drifts while the physical market seizes up. When that spread snaps, when the invisible rule asserts itself, it doesn't correct gradually. The market halts. Delivery fails. We saw a preview during the pandemic. Supply chains froze and panic buying set in. That was a temporary dislocation. What is forming now is structural. The mines are not there. The stockpile is moving east. And the paper market is living in a hallucination. The banking institutions see it. They are issuing quiet forecasts of a massive repricing, numbers that would shock the average investor. But their models assume a functioning market. They assume normal delivery. What happens if the mechanism breaks? What happens if the metal simply isn't for sale at any price? Then we don't get a rally. We get a parabolic seizure. The mathematics of industrial desperation. The demand side is already written in ink. The energy transition requires a volume of metal that does not currently exist. This is not a forecast. These are funded projects. The U.S. grid needs a complete overhaul, hundreds of thousands of miles of transmission lines. That is millions of tons of copper that must be bought. Then there is the reshoring of manufacturing. The semiconductor plants, the factories, they are all copper-heavy. India is electrifying a continent. But here is the historical precedent. All this demand is colliding with a supply ceiling. The deficit is not theoretical. It is arriving next year. The easy metal is gone. What's left is in jurisdictions with extreme political risk, nationalization in Chile, instability in Peru. We have outsourced our critical supply chain to volatile regions, right as demand goes vertical. You are watching the exact setup that caused the great commodity shocks of the 1970s. But copper is different. There is no substitute. You cannot print copper. You cannot legislate more ore grades. The industrial necessity is locked in. The shortage is here. The market just hasn't admitted it yet. Preservation and the trap. How do you position yourself when the mechanism breaks? Most people will rush to the paper market, futures and options. But that is walking into the trap. If the exchange disconnects from reality, paper contracts are settled in cash, not metal. You don't own the asset. You own a claim on a bankrupt system. Physical ownership is difficult. The density makes it hard to store in meaningful quantities. It's not like silver or gold. That forces us to look at the producers, the miners. When the currency is debased against the metal, the producers don't just profit. They reprice entirely. But you must be surgical. A mine in a jurisdiction that seizes assets is worth zero. Operational risks are real. The passive money will buy ETFs and hope for the best. The smart money is looking for leverage and jurisdiction safety. Conclusion. The conclusion is a matter of arithmetic. Demand is compounding. Supply is geological. The gap is widening. Copper is adhering to the invisible rule. The physical shortage will eventually force the paper market to capitulate. The institutional capital is already moving. The East is hoarding. The West is sleeping. When the headlines finally admit the shortage, the window to act will have already closed. This is not a trade. It is a recognition of where the physical world is going. History shows us that when these imbalances correct, they do so violently. Watch the stockpiles, not the ticker. Let me know if you see the pattern. Are you watching the physical flows, or are you distracted by the daily noise? Subscribe if you want to track the breakdown, because when this mechanism fails, it will happen overnight.